What if Caitlin Clark doesn't actually have to score 30 points to completely break a defense? Because after Indiana's 106-92 win over the New York Liberty on August 11th, Sabrina Ionescu basically explained the problem herself. And once you understand what she was talking about, Caitlin Clark's 22 points and 10 assists suddenly look even more impressive. The Fever didn't beat New York simply because they got hot from three. They forced the Liberty into a series of impossible defensive decisions, and Clark was right in the middle of almost every one. The most interesting part came after the game, when Ionescu was asked about what went wrong. Her explanation was simple. Indiana's bigs were creating problems in the paint, which forced New York's defenders to help, and once those defenders moved, Indiana could kick the ball back outside. And then came the name that made the entire explanation click: Caitlin Clark. Ionescu pointed to Clark's shooting, her ability to attack downhill, and most importantly, her ability to make the right read. That's the real Caitlin Clark problem. You can't simply guard her one way and expect the problem to disappear. If you back away from Clark because you're worried about her three-point range, you've given her room to attack. If you step higher to take away the jumper, she can use the space behind you. If another defender comes over to stop the drive, somebody else is suddenly open. And if that open player is Kelsey Mitchell, you might have an even bigger problem. Mitchell finished this game with 28 points, including 20 in the first half, while Clark finished with 22 points and 10 assists. Now think about what New York's defense was being asked to do. The Liberty wanted to protect the paint, especially against Indiana's interior threats. That sounds completely reasonable. But basketball is a chain reaction. The moment one defender moves toward the lane, another defender has to think about the corner. The moment that defender moves, the weak side has to rotate. And the moment the ball reaches Clark, she has to decide whether to shoot, drive, or move it again. That's where her passing becomes so dangerous. A normal box score tells you that Clark had 10 assists, but it doesn't tell you how many defensive movements happened before those assists. It doesn't tell you how many defenders hesitated because they knew she could shoot from deep. It doesn't tell you how many times a teammate became open simply because Clark's presence forced the defense to make a decision. That's why this wasn't simply a Caitlin Clark scoring performance. It was a decision-making performance. And Indiana's teammates made those decisions hurt. Kelsey Mitchell punished New York's perimeter defense. Aliyah Boston gave Indiana another interior threat. Sophie Cunningham also hit 4 of her 5 three-point attempts, adding another layer to the spacing problem. Suddenly, New York couldn't just say, "Stop Caitlin." Because if they sent extra attention toward Clark, Indiana had shooters waiting. If they stayed home on those shooters, Clark had more room. And if they crowded the paint, Indiana could move the ball until the defense was forced to chase. This is why the 16 made threes from Indiana are important, but they aren't the entire story. The Fever shot an incredible 16 for 24 from 3, including 11 for 14 in the first half. That's an extraordinary shooting night, and obviously isn't something Indiana can simply guarantee every game. Sabrina Ionescu even acknowledged that question after the game. If Indiana doesn't make all those shots, maybe the result looks different. And that's fair. But here's the part opponents should worry about. They don't necessarily have to make 16 threes for the underlying problem to remain. The repeatable part is the pressure on the defense. The repeatable part is Clark's ability to recognize where the help is coming from. The repeatable part is having multiple teammates capable of making the defense pay. And that's where Indiana's offense becomes much more interesting. Imagine you're defending Clark at the top of the key. You know she can pull up from deep. You know she can attack the basket. You know she can find a shooter if you bring help. Now imagine Boston is occupying the interior while Mitchell is moving around the perimeter. You don't have 5 defenders who can simply stare at Clark. You have 5 defenders trying to solve 5 different problems at the same time. And that's what makes Clark's passing so valuable. She doesn't need to force the game. She can let the defense tell her what it wants to give up. If they give her the shot, she can shoot. If they give her the lane, she can drive. If they send help, she can pass. And if the first pass doesn't completely break the defense, Indiana can keep moving until the advantage becomes a quality shot. That is much harder to defend than simply trying to stop a high-volume scorer. And there's another important detail here. Clark scored 22 points. That's a very good scoring night, but it wasn't a 40-point explosion. She didn't need one. Her impact was distributed across the offense. Mitchell scored 28. Boston scored 19. The Fever scored 106. That's the nightmare scenario for a defense. You can survive one superstar having a huge scoring night if everyone else struggles. It's much harder when the superstar is creating opportunities and multiple teammates are converting them. That's why I wouldn't describe the Liberty's problem as simply they couldn't stop Caitlin Clark. The deeper problem was that every attempt to reduce one threat exposed another. And that is exactly what makes Indiana's offense dangerous when the pieces are clicking. Now, does this mean Clark is impossible to defend? Absolutely not. That's where we need to be careful. New York has beaten Indiana before, and no offensive system works perfectly every possession. Clark can turn the ball over. Indiana's shooters can miss. Screens can be mistimed. Defenders can disguise coverage. A smart defense can disrupt the first action and force the Fever into a less comfortable possession. The question isn't whether Clark can be stopped on individual possessions. Of course she can. The question is whether a defense can consistently stop the entire chain of decisions without giving Indiana something else to attack. That's a much bigger challenge. And the Liberty now have something valuable that they didn't have before this game. Film. They know what happened. They know Indiana attacked their defensive choices. They know the paint helped created opportunities outside. And when these teams meet again, New York can adjust. The next matchup will be fascinating because the Liberty don't have to eliminate every threat. They simply have to decide which threat they are willing to live with. Do they pressure Clark higher and risk opening space behind the defense? Do they stay attached to the shooters and give Clark more driving room? Do they change the coverage and try to disrupt Indiana's rhythm before the ball gets into Clark's hands? Every answer comes with a price. And that is the real story behind Sabrina Ionescu's comments. She didn't reveal that Caitlin Clark is unbeatable. She revealed something more interesting. The defense has to constantly make choices when Clark is controlling the action. And on August 11th, Indiana won those choices over and over again. The Fever scored 106 points, hit 16 threes, and Clark finished with 22 points and 10 assists. The box score tells you who won. Ionescu's explanation tells you why the game became so difficult for New York. So the next time someone says, Caitlin Clark only had 22 points, remember this game. Sometimes the biggest impact a point guard can have isn't the number beside her name in the scoring column. It's the number of defensive decisions she forces the opponent to make. And when every one of those decisions creates another problem, that's when an offense becomes incredibly difficult to stop. The question now isn't whether the Liberty can defend Caitlin Clark. They already know they can. The question is whether they can defend Clark without opening the door for everyone around her. And that is the Caitlin Clark problem.